Okay, so this is my brief review of Chapter 6, New Jim Crow. All right, so first she talks about, she uses a quote from Al Sharpton that talks about the fact that the criminal justice system appears to target young black men. So she shows that civil rights leaders are aware of issues with the criminal justice system, but for some, logistical reasons, they don't want to organize strongly against mass incarceration. So, she says that when civil rights advocates came to the defense of a handful of young black teens who beat up a white schoolmate and were charged with attempted murder, which advocates argued wouldn't have been the case if the perpetrators were white, this fight happened after the school gained media attention for nooses hanging from trees in the campus courtyard. So, an obvious racialized threat that harkens back to the Jim Crow era. So, as a result, there were protests and organizing around these boys, which made Michelle Alexander wonder, why are they absent for all the young black men incarcerated for petty drug crimes? Not even violent offenses, right? These aren't people getting in fights or beating up people. What makes mass incarceration a different issue? So she, this is, again, I keep pulling quotes because she's got quotes for days. So any racial justice movement to be successful must vigorously challenge the public consensus that underlies the prevailing system of control. So she argues that the approaches to the current racialized problems need to be addressed with current solutions, not old ones that served old systems of control. We need new ones for now. So, she calls this rethinking denial. So few recognize how the system operates, which limits the opportunities for transformative collective action. So, unless you've read the book, unless you've taken crim classes, unless you've really taken it upon yourself to study this, like we've talked about before, most people watch Law and Order and go, oh yeah, no, I know how the system works, right? Or I had it in a civics class in high school, so I get how it works, right? But not actually coming into contact with it themselves. They don't understand how the structure of this system, the scope, the depth of this issue. Most people are not going to stand up and collectivize and organize around getting people out of prison, right? Because most people don't understand how people were swept up into it in the first place. So of course, that's going to, limit opportunities for transformative collective action, right? So also she says that civil rights advocates are noticeably silent on mass incarceration. So, the prevailing public consciousness affects everybody, even civil rights advocates. So they're just as susceptible to media bias and political rhetoric that racializes issues within the criminal justice system. And civil rights history has its own version of this, right? This strategic ways that they've tried to change public opinion. So, earlier waves of the movement were successful because they were grassroots campaigns and they were closely aligned to the communities they were charged with defending and protecting. But after the success of Brown v. Board of Education, and soon after the passage of the Civil Rights Act, many advocates argue that, the power of change rested within the court. So as a result, civil rights organizations became professionalized, right? They became focused on law, hired a bunch of lawyers, and they lost their connection to the communities and the people that they were advocating for. So instead of a moral crusade, the movement has become a legal crusade. So she argues that challenging mass incarceration is tricky because it requires advocating on behalf of criminals, and most people aren't going to do that, right? So she brings it back to a little bit of history with Rosa Parks, Claudette Coleman, and Marie Louise Smith. So, most people have heard of Rosa Parks, right? They assume she was the first woman. She didn't get up. She didn't move her seat. She didn't move to the colored section, right? But actually, two women did the same thing before she did. But advocates decided they wouldn't be good test cases because they had perceived morality flaws. So Claudette was only 15 when she courageously resisted. Really weird, small world kind of thing. Actually, she actually knew Rosa Parks, and Rosa Parks didn't tell her that she was going to go do the same thing that Claudette had already done. Um, the way that the narrative is constructed is Rosa Parks, long day at work. She was just tired. She just kept sitting and whatever, right? But in reality, this was kind of a staged, planned event. Claudette, again, she was 15. Her case wasn't pursued because she was pregnant from a much older man. She was teen pregnant, right? Nowadays she'd be on MTV2 or whatever. But back then, she was also, um, yeah. So yeah, being 15 and pregnant, that's not like the poster girl for a movement, right? When you're trying to get white people to be sympathetic to your issues, right? And then Marie's Louise Smith was not used as a case after it was rumored that her father was an alcoholic, right? Ugh, isn't that ridiculous? That would be enough to be like, let's malign her and her courageous actions forever into history, right? So Rosa Parks was this upstanding, everyone in her family, including herself and everyone else in her family, was above reproach. So she was used as the one to test this case, right? So it's really fascinating. Like Claudette Coleman, very bravely as a 15-year-old didn't, refuse this. But since she, later became pregnant right after, again, it's this kind of thing of like, why do you think those cases weren't pursued? Because of the politics of respectability, right? Advocates are trying to combat those racial stereotypes by offering examples of Black people that white people would consider good. So this time-tested strategy does not work against the criminal justice system, right? Many of the victims in the criminal justice system have committed some crimes and are not completely innocent, right? So it becomes this issue, like if civil rights leaders are trying to approach this issue from a way to not have negative blowback or associations when a group of people is already marginalized and already assumed to be criminal, if you stand up and try and protect people that are in jail or labeled by the criminal justice system as criminal, that's really just kind of almost hearkening upon stereotypes, right? So, you don't want to draw attention to people you consider the worst of your community, right? So, it's terrible. So that's what she argues is why civil rights leaders are noticeably silent when it comes to mass incarceration. So in order to get back to this pre-war on drugs level of incarceration, we would have to release 4 out of every 5 prisoners. That's how massive the problem is, right? The scale of this is huge. So this is just for those incarcerated, right? That doesn't include all of those on correctional supervision, probation, or parole. So, we talked a little bit about this throughout the course, but private prisons themselves have a vested interest and economic imperative to run the criminal justice system the way it is, in a way that they can make a profit, right? They can make money by owning private prison facilities. So I'm going to show you a couple clips that go into how some of these work and how some of this money works. So I know there were recent changes where Obama, before he left office, basically said he put a plan in place to end federal private prisons. Again, that would not affect state-run private prisons, which are, a lot of those private prison industries. But that was a really encouraging step. But of course, now with the Trump administration, that has been reversed. So we'll see how that goes. Actually, on the day that they announced that, the private prison industry stock went up dramatically. So we'll see how that continues to go. But in the meantime, let me show you these clips really quick, just to kind of give you some background information on this, and also how not only is this happening specifically to people that are U.S. citizens, but also to people that are undocumented, how they're getting pulled into also for-profit lockups.
Between 1970 and 2005, the US's prison population grew by a massive 700%, far outpacing both population growth and crime rates. Today, it's got to the stage where America is home to 5% of the world's population, but a quarter of the world's prisoners. And not only does America have the highest imprisonment rates of any country in the entire world, but it also has the highest rate of youth incarceration. Over 130,000 juveniles are detained in the US every year, and on any given day there are more than 70,000 youths in detention. But the biggest winners of this mass incarceration haven't been the American public, but the private prison companies who are making giant profits out of people being in jail. According to the American Civil Liberties Union, in 2010, the 2 largest prison companies alone received nearly $3 billion in revenue, while their top executives each received annual compensation packages worth more than $3 million. Private prisons didn't really exist before the early 1980s, when US states and the federal government needed a solution to the overcrowding in public prisons. But between 1990 and 2009, the number of people in private prisons increased by a massive 1,600%. And the business model of these private prison companies essentially depends on locking more and more people up. The biggest of the US's private prison companies is the Corrections Corporation of America, otherwise known as the CCA. In its 2010 annual report to shareholders, the CCA stated, "The demand for our facilities and services could be adversely affected by the relaxation of enforcement efforts, leniency in conviction or parole standards and sentencing practices, or through the decriminalisation of certain activities that are currently proscribed by our criminal laws." The CCA seems to be particularly concerned about the decriminalisation of drug use and any potential changes to immigration laws. For instance, any changes with respect to drugs and controlled substances or illegal immigration could affect the number of persons arrested, convicted and sentenced, thereby potentially reducing demand for correctional facilities to house them. Because of these concerns, private prison companies spend a lot of money on lobbying politicians. According to analysis by the Associated Press, between 2002 and 2012, the CCA, along with the US's second and third largest private prison companies, Geo Group Inc. and Management and Training Corporation, otherwise known as MTC, spent around $45 million on lobbying state and federal governments between them. And in addition to lobbying, these three companies also pour hundreds of thousands of dollars every year into the election campaigns of governors, state legislators and judges. And a report by the National Institute on Money and State Politics revealed that between 2003 and 2011, the CCA alone hired 199 lobbyists in 32 states, while GEO hired 72 lobbyists in 17 states. Worryingly, private prisons in America have been linked to numerous cases of violence and poor conditions. This CCTV video shows a brutal beating of 24-year-old Hani Elebed by another inmate at the CCA-run Idaho Correctional Center in January 2010. Elebed was left with permanent brain damage from the attack and later died in 2012, though it was unclear whether his death was related to the injuries he sustained in prison. Following the attack on Elebed, the American Civil Liberties Union filed a lawsuit against the CCA on behalf of a number of inmates at the centre. The inmates claimed that violence at the centre was so widespread they called it Gladiator School, and that understaffing and mismanagement by CCA officials was contributing to the violence rate. The CCA denied these claims, but agreed to a settlement in which they were instructed to carry out operational changes and increase staffing levels. However, more than 2 years later, in September 2013, a federal judge found the CCA in contempt of court for violating this settlement. And then the following month, the CCA announced that it would be leaving Idaho. The ACLU has also filed a lawsuit against the state of Mississippi over conditions at the East Mississippi Correctional Facility. Donald Weeks is a former prisoner at the facility, which was run by GEO until July 2012 and is now run by MTC.
It was run by GEO the first 2 months that I was there. Just dirty, nasty, unsanitary conditions. I mean, people get stabbed in there, they're bleeding, or they get in a fight and they're bleeding. They don't give them no cleaning chemicals to clean the place up or nothing. The sewer kept backing up in the zones, the toilets kept stopping up. Stench was so bad in there, I couldn't eat anymore.
A spokesperson for MTC says that conditions have significantly improved since the company took over from GEO, but the ACLU disputes this. This track record is all the more worrying because many of those in private prisons are some of the most vulnerable people in the system. Nearly 40% of all detained juveniles are committed to private facilities, while nearly half of all immigrant detainees are now held by private companies. And to be clear, most immigrant detainees are being held while waiting to have their cases decided in court, not serving time for a crime they've been convicted of committing. In 2012, a federal judge transferred all prisoners out of the formerly GEO-managed Walnut Grove Youth Correctional Facility in Mississippi after finding it to be a picture of such horror as should be unrealized anywhere in the civilized world. Prison staff had sex with imprisoned youths in what investigators called among the worst we've seen in any facility in the nation. According to GEO, the abuses documented occurred before the company had taken over Walnut Grove in late 2010, but this is disputed by the US Justice Department. This map, produced by the ACLU following a Freedom of Information request, also shows allegations of sexual abuse of detainees since 2007 at immigration detention facilities across the US. In total, there have been nearly 200 reports of sexual abuse during this time, but the ACLU believes that this is just the tip of the iceberg and that many other cases have gone unreported. Unfortunately for the private prison companies, however, crime rates in the US have actually been on the decrease for the past decades, and so they've been resorting to more aggressive tactics to make money. A 2013 report from the In the Public Interest Resource Centre revealed that some companies have been signing contracts with states that contain clauses guaranteeing high prison occupancy rates. Some contracts require 90 to 100% occupancy. This means that if the private prisons in question aren't filled to the agreed capacity, then either the state has to find more people to put in those prisons or pay the company for the unused beds. And 3 companies in Pennsylvania even resorted to bribing officials to get beds in their facilities filled. In August 2011, former Luzerne County Judge Mark Chivarella Jr. was sentenced to 28 years in prison after sending children to detention centers owned by these companies in return for illegal payments amounting to millions of dollars. Some of those he sentenced were as young as 10 years old. And now, campaign groups like the ACLU and Brave New Foundation fear that private prison companies could be set to profit from federal immigration reform. The US House Judiciary Committee has passed the SAFE Act, which, if turned into law, would turn millions of undocumented immigrants into criminals overnight and make not having papers punishable by months or even years in US prisons. But if business starts to go bad for the private prison companies in the US, then there's always the rest of the world. The UK currently has a 106% prison occupancy rate, creating an opportunity for private prison companies to jump in as they did in the US in the 1980s, while Australia's controversial immigration detention system is now operated entirely by private companies. And last year, GEO saw 14% of its revenues coming from international contracts.
There's a profit incentive to incarcerating people. There are some companies who are showing big profits who will tell you that things have never been better. Global Telink takes advantage of people who are so vulnerable. The father's in prison, it costs $17 to call dad for 15 minutes. Corizon makes money off sick prisoners by denying care. It's as simple as that. The GEO Group is able to make amazing profits by not doing their job, by not keeping facilities clean, by going cheap. The bail bondsman industry is taking advantage of people in jail by charging unbelievable amounts of money to get out. Cops seize assets by merely suspecting someone of illegal behavior. And so your car, or whatever possessions you have on your person, can be taken away. CCA is moving to make prison sentences longer and harsher and making laws easier to break. America has 2.2 million incarcerated people. It's a statistic that we should be ashamed of.
In the state of Arizona, has legalized racial profiling.
The detention of migrants is a multi-billion-dollar industry.
One in which immigrants are traded like products.
They are for sale to the highest bidder.
Who benefits and who profits? Corrections Corporation of America, or CCA, the GEO Group, and the Management and Training Corporation combined own over 200 facilities in the nation.
With over 150,000 bed spaces for a total profit of close to $5 billion per year.
Private prisons profit like a hotel. The more occupants that go in, the more money comes out.
You just sell it like you're selling cars, or real estate, or hamburgers.
Private prisons rely on anti-immigrant laws that guarantee them access to fresh inmates.
Here's how they do it. The American Legislative Exchange Council, or ALEC, is an extreme right-wing membership organization comprised of state legislators and powerful multinational corporations, including the Corrections Corporation of America.
ALEC is the most active private prison lobbyist group pushing for anti-immigrant laws like Arizona's SB 1070.
Russell Pierce, like CCA, is an ALEC member, one with obscure ties to national white separatist neo-Nazi groups. During an ALEC meeting, CCA and Pierce crafted a model legislation that became, almost word for word, Arizona's SB 1070.
Whether people are undocumented or not doesn't matter.
As long as they fill the detention facilities for days, months, or even years.
SB 1070 and their copycat laws sprouting up across the country represent the perfect money machine.
All right, so the legal changes that have eviscerated the Fourth Amendment, which gives police officers full discretion to stop anyone who's, quote, perceived to be criminal, end quote, right? This opens the door for wide racial discrimination, which again is definitely part of our American history. But what has made the system profitable is the ability of departments to retain what property they come across in drug forfeitures. So the financial incentive and the lax rules on what it can be spent on, and the fact that a person does not need to be convicted or even charged with a crime for the property to be seized is a major hurdle to real reform in the criminal justice system. So when it comes to changing the culture of policing, changing the financial incentive is very important, but changing racial profiling as a technique of policing in certain communities with more aggression and less compassion and restraint on some groups than others is something that perpetuates the racial caste system and solidifies poor people as second-class citizens all across the country, right? So that's something that this culture of identifying people from a racial or ethnic bias needs to be it needs to be addressed. And part of that, a lot of research has looked at how having more people on the police force that are diverse has a very important countering effect when it comes to stereotypes and bias and judgment against communities of color. So she also talks about the cyclical nature of racial progress, which is, this kind of unstable equilibrium. So the biggest hurdle is really public consensus. After so many years of racialized coverage of crime and stigma and stereotypes of, the kind of like, you fit the description because you're a young black male, right? Seeing young black men as criminal is a perspective that needs to change in order for true change to come about. So Omi Monant, who are these kind of like hotshot sociology race researchers, one's at Santa Barbara, one's at Berkeley, they're both kick-ass. They argue that people accept racial ideology and it remains marginal during, the strength of paradigms. So really, until this racial equilibrium is challenged, then, the state will initially challenge it, but eventually absorb the critiques offering reforms that are largely symbolic, but do little to actually change the racial order. So meaning, we'll say things like, okay, we're going to change the 100 to 1 because it's unfair. So they change it to 18 to 1, right? That doesn't actually change the structure of it, right? There's still a large inequality there. But that idea, they say that it absorbs the critiques offering reforms, meaning that you're saying, well, look, we made reforms. We changed this. We adapted it. What's your problem? Why are you still complaining about it, right? So without real egalitarian racial consensus, the cycle just gives rise to a new system of racialized social control that will just look different and sound different, but will be the new caste system past mass incarceration that she argues will happen unless we confront what's really at play here. So in order to resist attempts to attack the criminal justice system on purely race-neutral terms, that's not going to address the proven racial bias in the criminal justice system, right? It's not as if this is just people pointing or hemming and hawing. I mean, you can point to so many overwhelming piles of statistics that show the inequality at play at every level, right? So we know this happens. How do we now do something about it, right? In larger society, this is a problem, and also when it comes to the issue of policing itself. So she compares, this colorblind advocacy, so this modern day system, right? Because really, if you look at all the facts, there are oppressive racial discrimination that's taking place at every level in the system, ensuring that some people we consider criminal in the first place are locked away for lengthy crimes, while other people that we consider good and trustworthy, like white people, are caught, convicted for the same crimes, but they're given drug treatment, or they're given probation, or they're given lesser sentences, or sometimes no charges at all, right? So she says the first thing we need to do is admit that the system itself is broken, right? It's like that. The first step is to admit you have a problem, right? We have looked at example after an example, seen corrupt practices, barriers for poor people of color that are largely absent for others, right? Especially long sentences for petty drug crimes, which has fueled an unprecedented explosion of prison population and those under correctional control, right? We have more people in prison than anyone else in the entire world. That's insane, right? And that's not even considering just the prison, but also under correctional control, so on probation, on parole. So if the point of the system is to curb crime, it has failed. If the purpose is to be a form of racial control, it is more than succeeded, right? If it's a purpose to be a form of social class control, it is more than succeeded, right? So we really have to be like, what is this actually about? So, current policing is better at creating crime than curbing it. So obviously crime is an important issue, and crime is responsible for a lot of suffering and negativity, especially in poor communities of color. But Michelle Alexander is arguing that the resentment that's caused from the style of dragnet, abusive, often violent police interactions only causes strife between communities and police. It does little to address the real crime issues that are going on in neighborhoods and the social controls placed on many due to petty non-violent drug crimes. That leads them to return to crime when they're released because they don't have opportunities that can improve their lives. When simply finding a place to live or a job or food becomes a daily hurdle, especially when you're saddled with large fees and fines upon release, it's not a shock that people would go back to a system that they know is wrong, that they would prefer not to be wrapped up in. But if for lack of other options is their only choice, that is terrible, right? That is a structural issue. So, some argue that the system does work when you show them statistics that crime has dropped largely in the past 2 decades. So she calls this skewing the stats to success, right? But incarceration has quickly outpaced and in no way reflects the rates of crime in most communities. So people oversimplify, saying that criminals are all locked up. That's why crime rates are dropping. But that's a complete misnomer, right? These things are much more complicated than something that simple, right? Instead, it is the criminalizing of people and communities of color that leads to these startlingly high rates of, some people being locked up more than others. And again, this threat of the felon label is worse than the threat of crime. For many, it's the label of being a felon that places them in that permanent second-class status, right? It's going to cause a lot more harm within poor communities than someone having possession of a drug, right? And so, when it comes to the impacts of incarceration, this can often tear families and communities apart. So for many communities, the real impacts of incarceration is how families in larger communities are being destroyed and devastated by the larger structural changes outside of their control. So just as larger job loss of manufacturing we talked about in Code of the Street, as well as the structural and legal changes to policing and the war on drugs are out of people's control, so is the rise of the underground economy, right? It's not like people chose that. So again, this temptation there is to ignore race when it comes to advocacy. People don't like to talk about race, right? It's uncomfortable, especially for people that have unquestioned white privilege, right? It becomes this thing of like, well, I didn't do anything wrong. Well, what did I do? And you're like, it's not about you, right? For the love of God, it's not about you. It's about a structure of an institutional relationship over time, right? It's not about you and your specific identity and your racialized identity. It has nothing to do with that. It's that whole weird victim-y logic that a lot of people have when they don't understand what white privilege actually means often flies in the face of like actually getting things done and addressing these larger issues, right? It's an uncomfortable reality that some people are marginalized from birth because of their skin, right? But instead of criminalizing and stigmatizing whole groups of people, we need to address the structural racism, right? That public racial consensus that has become latent and not talked about because we don't want to face it. We don't want to talk about it. It's not a big deal. That was in the past, but that's not now. It's like, if it's not now, then how can we explain this whole last political cycle? So she says that a colorblind society is not progress. It assumes itself to be progress, right? When people are like, well, I don't see race, right? I just see people as people, right? That doesn't mean, like, I think when white folks say that, I think it comes from a good place. Like, I think it comes from a place where they're like, oh, well, I don't judge you negatively based on your race or ethnicity. I think that's what they mean by that. But when they say, I don't see race, I mean, that's ridiculous. It just means that they're ignorant to history. Like, if you don't see race, then you don't see reality, then you don't see history, then you don't see the legacy of segregated unequal schools, the legacy of segregated jobless ghettos, the legacy of segregated public discourse that largely ignores issues of poor communities of color to this day. So like, to be colorblind is basically to say, well, race might have been a thing back in the day, but it doesn't matter now, which is not true. It just doesn't matter to you because you don't face it, right? It's that same kind of thing, like it, just because it doesn't happen to some people, we can have this colorblind rhetoric. And this has been very promoted culturally since the 90s, right? If people feel that way, it's not like a negative necessarily, like they meant to do that, right? It's just more that that's what's been promoted, is like, oh, I don't see race. Yeah, but to not see race is to not see a legacy of colonization and oppression that has a timeline to this day, consequences to this day. So it leads to indifference to the plight of race, right? This colorblind rhetoric kind of makes it like, well, what? If you're a poor person of color that's facing problems, well, that's your own problem, right? Like that Ohio chair of the Trump campaign said, where she said, what? If black people have problems in the last 50 years, then that's on them. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps, which is insane because it's completely to ignore structural inequalities, laws that literally justified inequality, right? If you take all of that out of context, that's what colorblind is doing. It's taking all of it out of context. And of course, this is not a right or left issue. This is a problem all over the political spectrum. So for conservatives, colorblind ideology is linked to their interests, right? Because they can focus on the individual and ignore larger social groups and argue that, gross racial structural inequities aren't there, that it's an individual problem of communities, like, oh, well, black community just needs to take care of their kids, kind of like that Obama speech, right? But then again, Obama is supposedly the left, right? Even though he's a complete moderate. But, this idea that the left itself touts colorblindness as progress, right? Like not focusing or looking at race, like people just being at a baseline of equal. But the problem is they aren't at a baseline of equal, right? We haven't achieved that equality. It's the same thing of saying like, oh, well, sexism is over because, women aren't, there's such a thing as sexual harassment now. It's like, no, there's still a lot of inequality between men and women. Has there been progress? Of course. Has there been progress in race relations? Of course. But is it already equal and we can already just operate from it being an equal playing field? Of course not. So, that's really what this problem of colorblindness leads to. So here's a long ass quote from the book that she says it way better than I ever could. So seeing race is not the problem. People are like, I don't see race, right? Seeing race is not the problem. We should hope not for a colorblind society, but instead for a world in which we can see each other fully, learn from each other, and do what we can to respond to each other with love. That was King's dream. A society that is capable of seeing each of us as we are with love. That is a goal worth fighting for. Alrighty, so then she talks about affirmative action, which is the policy of favoring members of disadvantaged groups who suffer from discrimination in a culture. So these are laws and policies put in place in hiring and education in order to try to balance the social inequalities that kept minorities marginalized. So of course, when we think of affirmative action, we tend to think of it as people of color, but also, of course, was institutionalized and policies affected women who were also kept out of these things. Okay, so basically, this idea of like, what is it and who benefits? Ironically, this kind of issue of affirmative action has become so controversial in the 80s and beyond. But before that, there were a lot of measured gains within, especially you look at higher education as an example. Before affirmative action, people of color and the percentage of people of color and women in college was much, much lower. And in no way did the affirmative action say, oh, you pick a woman over a man. You pick a person of color over a white person, right? That's not actually how that works. You still have to meet every qualification, right? It's not as if, and that's, again, one of those assumptions, even Scalia, right before he died, made some offhanded, stupid comment about, oh, affirmative action, blah, blah, blah. It's he was saying that you're raising African Americans to a place beyond their standing, which was literally what people were saying in Jim Crow. But anyway, that's what he was also saying, Scalia, but he's dead, so whatever. But basically, he had this misnomer that a lot of people have, this idea that oh, if you're just a C student, but you're African American, you can just get into any college you want. That's not true, right? You still have to have straight A's, you still have to have extracurriculars, you still have to be just as qualified. The difference is they have to actually look at your application. That's the only difference. Literally the only difference. Once they got rid of those higher education affirmative action policies within California, the percentage of African Americans and, just largely the percentage of people of color in higher education dropped within 2 years from, I believe it was about 26% to 4%. So clearly those policies were helping people into these affirmative action policies, but they've been controversial because people consider them to be, what do they call? Dun, 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 reverse racism. Dun, 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 dun. Okay, well, how the hell could it be racism, right? That makes no sense. The idea of trying to lift someone up to the station that someone else already is at is somehow, equality is not oppression. White people got to get past that. Being equal with someone is not the same as them oppressing you, right? And the same idea that, to make it reverse racism, it would have to be a system where white people were all enslaved for hundreds of years and controlled through social narratives where they were told that they were terrible and criminal and awful and their women were used sexually by, members of this other race. It's such a bizarre thing to be oh, it's racism when a person of color gets an opportunity instead of a white person. Well, the idea of who benefits and who should have benefit, does that not just reinforce the structure of white supremacy? I mean, really, when you think about it, right? When you think about this idea that people say a person of color is taking something from a white person, what's the assumption there? That the justifiable, rightful person that should be in that position is white. Why do we believe that? Because of freaking white supremacy, right? We don't know that that person is inherently better or worse. We just make racialized assumptions based on the way we're socialized and the way our culture values, one group as dominant over everyone else. So it's, anyway, when it comes to this idea of a reverse racism, that's ridiculous, right? It's this idea it's reverse sexism if a woman gets considered for a position in a field where women were excluded historically over time. It's that's ridiculous, right? But again, this is fear that people have when they are in power. There's a fear that they have that somehow they will lose that power and that that they're going to have to face the kind of exploitation and oppression that they've put on other people, which is not at all what that is, right? Like another person having an opportunity to go to the college that you go to is not somehow putting you down or affecting you negatively, right? But again, this idea that like, well, the white guy deserved it. This other person has to prove they deserve it. That's just kind of a mirror up to our white supremacist culture. So, a lot of people do, again, she gets into this, right? This idea that it's a racial bribe. So she says basically affirmative action is largely a racial bribe, that it puts a band-aid on inequality because it does little to address the underlying social inequalities, which is very true. So, for example, on page 245, she argues that A, it has rendered a racial caste invisible, right? Because it's like, see, everyone's equal now, affirmative action, which is not how that worked. B, it has helped perpetuate the myth that anyone can make it if they try, right? Which, again, there's so many structural barriers for most people that that's not actually true. C, it has encouraged the embrace of trickle-down theory of racial justice. So that's a great one to expand upon, this idea of like tokenism, right? So seeing someone like Barack Obama and saying, see, any African American can be president. And you're like, really? Really? Because one guy was? That means that anyone could be? Right? Maybe from some lofty philosophical place, but when it really comes to like the structural barriers that make it so that, if you're born a person of color, you're much more likely to be poor, you're much more likely to face an education system that's not good. Like, he was very, privileged. He, had some wealthy family, and that kind of put him in a higher social echelon that they draw upon for congressional leaders and for higher office political contenders. I mean, that's kind of ridiculous to be like, it's the same thing they do with Oprah, right? Like, they'll say like, Oprah, look at her. She's worth so much money. It's ridiculous. Like, she came from humble beginnings, so therefore, so can you, so can anyone. But that's not true, right? I mean, should we celebrate these people for their achievements? Yes, of course we should. But should we act as if anyone can do it and that there aren't huge barriers that are stopping a lot of people from doing it? No, because that's a lie that we tell ourselves to make ourselves feel better and say, hey, racism's over, no more problems, no more structural issues to deal with here. But there still are, obviously, is what she's getting at. Okay, so then back to her list of stuff. D, it has greatly facilitated the divide and conquer tactics that give rise to mass incarceration. And E, it has inspired such polarization and media attention that the general public now wrongly assumes that affirmative action is the main battlefront in U.S. race relations. So this assumptions of racial progress, taking stats without including the millions of people behind bars, skews racial progress that has been made since the Jim Crow era, right? So this shows that for some of the most marginalized communities, things are actually worse for them now than they were in the past, especially when you look at rates of unemployment, startlingly high rates of infant mortality in the Black community, right? So she argues that when you pull back the curtain of colorblindness and really look at getting rid of these kind of, policies that put a band-aid but don't actually change the structures of the system, research show that many of those gains would vanish. You simply get rid of the affirmative action policy like they did in California for the education, and you saw like an immediate drop in enrollment for people of color, right? Meaning that they didn't actually change the structure of the system. They just put a little band-aid on it. Once you rip off that band-aid, it doesn't heal. So, again, I know I kind of already went on this one for like a while. But, oh yeah, no, I totally didn't even get to this part. Hold on, let me go back. All right, so I talked about racial progress, but I totally skipped the Black middle class. So anyway, racism is so entrenched that without the intervention of affirmative action, the Black middle class would pretty much evaporate as it is now. So, the denying of realities of the lack of racial progress paints a narrative that racism and inequality are a thing of the past. This leads to these arguments that people have that personal or cultural reasons are to blame for why so many Black or brown people are incarcerated, right? So it's their culture. They just don't take care of their kids right, or they just don't this, or that, which is crazy because it ignores structural issues completely. It paints the victims as guilty because they lack good virtues that white people have. And that's why white people are so much more successful, because they have better virtues. It's not that they have the structure of society at their back, helping them out, making sure other people are jumping over hurdles that they aren't, right? So again, back to this black exceptionalism. So, critical to maintaining colorblindness is seeing high-profile, successful people of color who are pointed to when communities and groups say that there's still issues. So again, like that thing I was saying about Oprah, you can say, hey, women of color, like we talked about, when you look at like the income, the wage gap between men and women and what they earn, they say, well, 77 cents to the male dollar is what women earn, right? Or 75 cents averaged. But when it really comes down to it, black women earn 64 cents to the male dollar. So that's different, right? So again, and if you point that out to people, they'll say, well, Oprah, right? She made it to the top. Meaning that if you don't, it's just because you lack character. You lack hard work. You just want to complain, or as they say, pull the race card, right? So, this is another quote, because I love pulling quotes from her, because she's got quotes for days. This is another quote from the book. If the prison label imposed upon them can be blamed on their culture, poor work ethic, or even their families, then society is absolved of responsibility to do anything about their condition. Mic drop, right? If you can just blame people like, hey, it's you because you just aren't a good person, then that's a hell of a lot easier than like having to kind of like reassess how our capitalistic structure of society is actually keeping a lot of people in really bad positions, right? Then we don't have to do anything about it because now it's just their fault. So back to her trickle-down theory. Oh, geez. So the idea is by giving a small number of minorities high positions in society, they will advocate for the rest of their group, and slowly racial progress will trickle down. This, of course, has no basis in actual fact, just as trickle-down economics has no basis in facts. Look it up. Anyway, there's no data supporting this when it comes to racial progress or the economy. So it's more of a hopeful notion, right? So when MLK was killed, he was advocating for economic restructuring of society that was necessary to alleviate the problems of racial and class inequality in America. He saw them as intertwined, right? So this work still needs to be done. It needed to be done in the 60s and it still needs to be done now, right? You can't just put like one person in charge of something or have like one black president and therefore, boom, racism's gone, right? No, not at all, right? It has to be a really inclusive process of actually including all members of society into the fold. So, Obama. So he admitted to using drugs in his youth. I mean, he didn't do the whole Clinton, like, I didn't inhale kind of thing, which is crazy. He did. But, there's this understanding that Obama had because of his own experiences of that kind of, that thing they say, like, if not for the grace of God, go I kind of thing. So because of this, people assumed he would work to end the war on drugs and the disproportionate impacts on communities of color because of something he campaigned during his campaigned on during his candidacy and championed because, he had dabbled here and there. He wasn't like an addict or anything, but just that idea, like if he could have been caught one of those times, he would have been incarcerated for a lengthy sentence, and that would have been the end of any sort of political potential he would ever have, right? So he kind of threw that idea that he was going to end the war on drugs in the face of advocates when he chose Joe Biden as his running mate and Rahm Emanuel, right? Oh, man. Joe Biden, while he is a hilarious meme and a little bit gropey, right? He's a groper. They're basically, both of these guys, him and Rahm Emanuel, are both strong proponents of the war on drugs. Rahm was one of the major promoters of welfare reform that was signed by Bill Clinton. So a lot of these structural problems that have been caused by the changes in the system, these guys championed that. And so that kind of flies in the face of him actually doing anything about it. So there was increased funding to these burn programs in the midst of the economic crisis. So even when they had no money, they put more money into police and the war on drugs instead of scaling it down. He increased funding and enforcement. And his policies on mass deportation of undocumented immigrants. I know it's not mentioned in the book because it falls outside of the scope of her argument, but I feel it's very important to mention because of the startlingly high numbers of people that were deported, more than any other president in U.S. history. We'll see if that holds. Sorry, I have to keep saying things like that. The rhetoric is that these are criminals being sent home, right? That's the idea, like, oh no, they're just sending them home. But in reality, many are held in these ICE detention facilities because they committed they didn't put on their right blinker, right? They did an unsafe lane change violation or some minor traffic violation, which separates them from their families, which takes them out of their communities, which does much more harm than good. So I'm going to show you a couple clips about this so that you can understand how Obama, they called, a lot of people called him the deporter in chief. But of course, this also kind of connects. I know this is outside of the scope of her specific argument, but it does connect to what you're seeing with the private prison industries and why, the connection to the kind of policing that is racialized in the war on drugs.
A coalition of immigration and civil rights groups has filed a complaint alleging widespread and systemic abuse of migrant children by U.S. Customs and Border Protection. Organizations including the National Immigrant Justice Center and the ACLU say they're acting on behalf of over 100 unaccompanied children mistreated by border agents after crossing into the United States. So far in 2014, U.S. Customs and Border Protection reports over 47,000 unaccompanied children have been detained after crossing the border, almost double the number for all of 2013, almost 5 times the number from 2009. President Obama has described the situation as a humanitarian crisis. A number of the children have been detained in shocking conditions. Over 1,000 children are reportedly being held at a warehouse in Nogales, Arizona, some sleeping in plastic containers. On Thursday, the Washington Post posted video showing makeshift holding areas for detained migrants at the McAllen, Texas Border Patrol station. The video shows dozens of women and children sprawled on concrete floors. Earlier this week, Democracy Now!'s Nermeen Sheikh and I spoke to 2 guests about the plight of these migrant children. In Houston, Jose Luis Zelaya, who fled Honduras in 2000 at the age of 13 in search of his mother. He traveled unaccompanied through Central America and finally reached Texas 4 months later. Zelaya is now a Ph.D. student at Texas A&M in the Department of Education, part of the Council for Minority Student Affairs at Texas A&M, and a member of the immigrant rights groups United We Dream. We also spoke to Sonia Nazario in Los Angeles. She's a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, author of Enrique's Journey, the story of a boy's dangerous odyssey to reunite with his mother. I started by asking Sonia Nazario about the number of migrant children being warehoused in the United States right now.
Well, this surge, as it's called, really started in 2011. We've seen over the last 3 years a 10-fold increase in the number of children coming here unaccompanied, unlawfully, and being placed in federal custody. And that doesn't even count the Mexican children, nearly 20,000 of those additionally, who are deported within 24, 48 hours. These are mostly children from Central America, from Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, and there's just been this enormous surge. Last month, in one day, we saw 1,000 children placed in federal custody, and on average, 400 children are arriving every single day. And again, the federal government has seen itself completely unprepared for this surge, which, 2 years ago we had a surge, and they opened Lackland Air Force Base for a couple of months and got caught with their pants down, and now again we're seeing the same problem.
And Sonia Nazario, you've actually characterized this problem as a refugee crisis. What do you think the federal government should be doing to cope with these numbers of children migrants coming to the U.S.?
Well, when I started looking at this and made the journey on top of these trains through Mexico myself to document what these children coming here alone, really a majority of these kids were coming to either work, flee abusive situations with their families in their home countries, or the vast majority were coming to reunify, in many cases with a mother who had left them behind in their home countries, moms who had come, single mothers by the millions to the United States and left their children behind with an aunt, a grandmother saying it'll be a year or two. Life here turned much more difficult than they thought it would be, and these separations stretched into 5 or 10 years or even more. And like the boy that I wrote about, Enrique, they despair of seeing their parents again, their moms kids again, and they would set off on their own to come and find them and make this very dangerous journey. So now, though, in the last few years, there's been this huge surge in violence in countries like Honduras has the highest homicide rate in the world. 30% of the population has been extorted by gangs or the cartels. And what you see in these neighborhoods, like Enrique's neighborhood, is, 6 in 10 kids. The surveys by UNHCR and others in the region are finding 6 in 10 children are fleeing for their very lives. Kids are no longer, in many instances, even going to school. They've had their parents or other family members murdered by these gangs. And someone yesterday with the Women's Refugee Commission said, this is no different than child soldiers in Africa, and we treat those children like refugees. Why would we not extend the same kind of treatment to children who are coming from vulnerable children from our neighbors to the south? Why would we not treat these children in the same way? And so I think the government really needs to step up its game, and both in terms of getting these kids out of Border Patrol facilities more quickly. They're supposed to do this within 72 hours, and they're not. And these are not places where children should spend long periods of time. There's no shower. There's an open toilet. Often they're having to take turns sleeping on the floor because there's not enough space. They should have prepared more shelters and been prepared for this surge, so there would be some place to put these kids. And I think they do need to be treating them more like refugees, screening these children for this kind of treatment. And finally, I think the government needs to provide attorneys to every single one of these children. These kids go, when they're apprehended, they are released usually to a guardian or a parent and then ordered to go to immigration court, but they're not entitled to any kind of public defender. And so when they stand before that immigration judge, I've seen very young children, 7 years old, 8 years old, 9 years old. Others have seen kids as young as 5 being asked to present these complex immigration cases before a judge. The government has an attorney who's arguing why that child should be hurtled back to these very dangerous circumstances, but these children don't have any advocate by their side. And this is not due process. I think we measure a country by how we treat children, and we're asking these children to do the impossible, which is to defend their right to be here. Not all of them should be able to stay, but we should give them due process. And what Eric Holder has done by assigning 100 attorneys and paralegals to do this is, a good first step, but really symbolic. He needs to really step it up and get a lot more attorneys involved.
Jose Luis Salas.
All right, so basically there's this group that came about from ex-prisoners trying to build a new grassroots civil rights movement, and she talks about them a little bit in the book. So I have a little clip here with a little video just to kind of explain this a little bit for you. Okay, so then when it comes to this, issue of white people and racial privilege, an essential part to ending the racial caste system is for white people to give up their white privilege and acknowledge that they are not better than other people, right? They're not inherently better. None of us are inherently better than anyone else, right? It often is just a result of what opportunities we're given, what structures we have, what, experiences and opportunities we have access to. So if we as white people could admit, all right, I have better opportunities, I have better access because I'm a white person, it's not about me working harder or me being better if I'm in a better social position. That has more to do with me having a higher rung on the social ladder, right? Than because of some inherent worth issue. So that's a really important thing to acknowledge when it comes to this issue of ending this racial caste system is, white supremacy. We have to get rid of this notion that one group is better than and should be strived for, right? That one is the example and that other people are kind of inherently locked out of that, right? And that's a huge problem because, we're only doomed to fail and repeat the histories of the past if we keep engendering this notion of white supremacy generationally. So, she argues that there needs to be a human rights movement. So again, this is why it's important for whites to get rid of their racial privileges, because this thing isn't going to end just from incarcerated people of color coming together and trying to organize around it. It is really going to take, just like within the civil rights movement, a larger consensus of the American public, specifically the white community as well, coming in and understanding these issues and caring enough about things that don't specifically affect them to enact change. Right? So simply working the Black community or the brown community limits the change that's needed. We need racial solidarity and a thriving multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy that's free from racial hierarchy. Then the civil rights model would actually be done at that point, right? The goal needs to be to dismantle the racial caste systems for good. And again, of course, a quote, because how can I not? She's got quotes for days, right? All right, so from page 258. If we want to do more than just end mass incarceration, if we want to put an end to the racial caste in America, we must lay down our racial bribes, join hands with people of all colors who are not content to wait for change to trickle down, and say to those who would stand in our way, accept all of us or none.